The blazing Texas sun hung low on the horizon as dust swirled through the streets of Redemption Creek, carrying whispers of a stagecoach robbery that had left 3 men dead and a woman missing, the 4th such incident in as many months. Marshal Miles Richardson wiped sweat from his brow, squinting at the distant hills where outlaws were rumored to hide their stolen bounty and captives. "Marshal, another telegram from Fort Worth," Deputy Jenkins announced, handing over the yellow paper. "They're sending reinforcements, but not for another fortnight." Miles crumpled the telegram in his fist. 2 weeks? The Blackwater gang won't keep their captives alive that long. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from its stand and checked the ammunition. "I'm riding out tonight." "Alone? That's suicide, Miles. They'll shoot you dead before you get within 100 yards of their hideout. Better than sitting here while innocent folks suffer." Miles secured his badge to his vest and pulled his wide-brimmed hat down low. "If I'm not back in 3 days, send word to my sister in Austin." As twilight descended, Miles rode out on his chestnut stallion, Thunder. The familiar weight of his revolver at his hip provided little comfort against the growing darkness. Redemption. Creek's modest collection of buildings faded behind him as he urged his horse toward the notorious Serpent Ridge, where the Blackwater gang was rumored to keep their base of operations. 2 days of hard riding brought him to the foothills. Miles tracked the gang through broken branches, cigarette butts, and occasional blood splatters that told a grim story. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he spotted thin wisps of smoke rising from a hidden valley between 2 rocky outcroppings. Miles tethered Thunder to a scrubby juniper and continued on foot, crawling through brush until he had a clear view of the outlaw camp. 5 men sat around a campfire, passing a bottle between them. Their laughter carried on the wind, crude and careless. A 6th man stood guard near a small cave entrance, rifle balanced across his forearms. But what caught Miles' attention was the figure bound to a post near the cave, a person with a burlap sack covering their head. From the slight frame and dress fabric visible beneath the dirt and grime, Miles knew it was a woman. The stagecoach passenger. His jaw clenched as he watched one of the outlaws saunter over to the captive, yanking her head back by the sack. Even at this distance, Miles could hear her muffled cry. Night fell slowly, and with it came Miles's opportunity. He waited until the bottle had made several more rounds, and 3 of the outlaws had retired to their bedrolls. 2 remained by the fire, with the guard still at his post, though his posture had grown more relaxed. Miles circled the camp, using the darkness for cover. He needed to create a distraction. Gathering several small rocks, he crept to the opposite side of the camp and threw them far into the brush, creating a rustling sound that immediately caught the attention of the remaining outlaws. "What was that?" One of them stood, drawing his pistol. "Check it out, Hank." The man named Hank grumbled but picked up his rifle and headed toward the noise. Miles waited until he was out of sight before making his move. With a quick strike from behind, he rendered the guard unconscious, then slipped into the camp. The 2 remaining outlaws were focused on where their companion had disappeared. Miles moved silently toward the captive woman. He untied the ropes binding her to the post, feeling her tense at his touch. "I'm Marshal Richardson," he whispered. "I'm here to rescue you." She made a muffled sound beneath the sack. "Come on, we need to—" "Hey!" One of the outlaws had spotted him. Both men drew their weapons. Miles pushed the woman behind him and drew his revolver. Gunfire erupted, shattering the night's silence. The marshal fired twice, hitting one outlaw in the shoulder. The man fell with a cry that would surely alert his companions. "Run!" Miles grabbed the woman's arm, guiding her away from the camp. They stumbled through the darkness, gunshots echoing behind them. Miles fired back blindly, hoping to slow their pursuers. They reached Thunder, and Miles helped the woman mount before climbing up behind her. The horse snorted nervously as more gunshots rang out. "Hold tight!" Miles kicked Thunder into a gallop, one arm secure around the woman's waist as they raced away from the outlaw camp. The sound of pursuit faded as they navigated treacherous mountain paths that the outlaws would struggle to follow in the dark. Miles didn't slow until they reached a small hidden cave he'd noted during his approach. He helped the woman dismount and led her inside, tethering Thunder to a tree outside. "We should be safe here for the night," he said, striking a match to light a small lantern he carried in his saddlebag. The cave illuminated with a soft glow. Let me get that off you." He moved behind her and carefully pulled the burlap sack from her head. A cascade of honey-gold hair tumbled down, framing a face so delicately beautiful that Miles froze in his tracks. Her eyes, bright blue despite the dim light, blinked rapidly as they adjusted. A small cut marked her cheek, and dirt smudged her fair skin, but nothing could diminish her striking beauty. "Angel," Miles whispered involuntarily. She looked at him with uncertainty, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had chafed them raw. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, her voice hoarse but melodic. "My name is Pearl Montgomery." Miles couldn't seem to find his voice for a moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Montgomery, are you injured?" "Nothing serious." She attempted to smooth her tattered dress. "They didn't. They were saving me for when they reached Mexico. Their leader said I'd fetch a good price." Anger flared in Miles's chest. "You're safe now. I'll get you back to town." Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "My father and brother were on the stagecoach with me. Did they—" Miles couldn't lie to her. "I'm sorry, Miss Montgomery. The report said 3 men were killed during the robbery." A sob escaped her lips, and she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "I feared as much. They tried to protect me." Miles hesitantly placed a hand on her shoulder. "I truly am sorry for your loss." She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Where are we going?" "Redemption Creek. It's about a day's ride from here. We'll rest tonight and leave at first light." Pearl looked around the small cave. "And you're certain they won't find us here?" "Reasonably certain. These hills are like a maze unless you know them well." Miles reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen and some jerky. "It's not much, but you should eat something." She accepted the offerings gratefully. As she drank from the canteen, Miles noticed how her hands shook. She'd been through hell, and yet there was a quiet dignity in her bearing that impressed him. "Where are you from, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, trying to distract her from their precarious situation. "Boston," she replied. "My father was bringing us west to start a new life after my mother passed. He had purchased land near Fort Worth." Her voice caught. "Now I don't know what I'll do." Miles added wood to the small fire he'd built. "Do you have other family you can stay with?" Pearl shook her head. "No one. It was just the 3 of us." She looked up at him, vulnerability and determination mingling in her gaze. "I suppose I'll have to find work somewhere. Redemption Creek is a growing town. There might be opportunities there." Miles didn't mention that those opportunities for a woman alone were limited and often disreputable. "We can figure it out once we get you safely back." Pearl nodded, then winced as she shifted position. "You are hurt," Miles said with concern. "Just bruised." "They weren't gentle when they took me." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be fine, Marshal, thanks to you." Miles felt a strange tightening in his chest. He'd rescued people before in his 5 years wearing the badge, but something about Pearl Montgomery affected him differently. Perhaps it was her courage in the face of such tragedy. Or maybe it was simply those eyes that reminded him of the clear Texas sky. "Try to get some sleep, Miss Montgomery. We have a long ride tomorrow." Pearl settled against the cave wall, wrapping her arms around herself. Miles removed his coat and offered it to her. "You'll be cold," she protested. "I'm used to it." He draped the coat over her shoulders anyway. "Good night, Miss Montgomery." "Good night, Marshal Richardson, and thank you for my life." Miles nodded, then positioned himself near the cave entrance, rifle across his lap. As Pearl drifted into an exhausted sleep, he kept watch, listening for any sound of pursuit. But his eyes frequently strayed to her sleeping form, and that whispered word echoed in his mind. Angel. Morning came with a golden glow that illuminated the cave. Miles, who had dozed only intermittently throughout the night, roused himself fully and checked outside. No sign of the outlaws. They'd probably continued searching in the wrong direction. He turned to wake Pearl and found her already awake, attempting to tidy her appearance with limited success. She'd used a bit of water from the canteen to wash her face and had braided her long hair to keep it neat. "Good morning," she said softly. "Any sign of them?" "None. We should get moving soon, though." Miles packed his few belongings and extinguished what remained of their fire. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." She stood, wincing slightly. I'm ready when you are. Miles led her outside to where Thunder waited patiently. I'm afraid we'll have to ride double again. Pearl nodded, approaching the horse with familiarity that surprised Miles. She stroked Thunder's neck gently. He's beautiful. My father bred horses in Boston before. She trailed off. You know horses, then? Yes, it was one of the few unladylike interests my mother tolerated. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. She said it was acceptable because Queen Victoria herself enjoyed riding. Miles helped her mount, then climbed up behind her. Having her this close was distracting the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body against his chest. He cleared his throat. It's about 8 hours to Redemption Creek if we push hard. We'll need to be careful when crossing open country. Pearl nodded. I trust your judgment, Marshal. They rode in silence for the first hour, picking their way carefully down from the hills. Miles remained vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Pearl sat straight in the saddle before him, occasionally pointing out wildlife, a red-tailed hawk, a jackrabbit darting through the brush. As they reached flatter ground, Miles allowed Thunder to move at a faster pace. The rhythmic movement seemed to ease some of the tension from Pearl's shoulders. Have you been a marshal long? She asked eventually. 5 years in Redemption Creek. Before that, I rode with the Rangers for a spell. And your family? Miles hesitated. My parents passed in a cholera outbreak when I was 17. I have a sister in Austin. She's married to a banker there. I'm sorry about your parents, Pearl said softly. It seems we're both familiar with loss. It's the way of things out here, Miles replied, though his tone was gentle. Life in the West isn't easy, but there's a freedom to it that you won't find back east. Freedom? Pearl repeated thoughtfully. That's what my father wanted. He said Boston was choking with rules and expectations. Was he right? Pearl considered this. Yes, I believe he was, though I imagine the West has its own set of rules. Fewer, but more essential. Keep your word, help your neighbors. Don't steal another man's horse. Miles felt her laugh softly. Simple things that matter when survival isn't guaranteed. They continued their journey, stopping briefly around midday to rest Thunder and eat some of the provisions Miles carried. Pearl moved stiffly, and Miles noticed her trying to massage her shoulder discreetly. Were you thrown from the stagecoach? He asked. She nodded. When they attacked, the driver was shot first. The coach veered off the road and overturned. My father and brother were... She swallowed hard. They were shot when they tried to fight back. I was dazed from the crash. By the time I fully understood what was happening, they had me tied up. Miles's jaw tightened. The Blackwater gang has been terrorizing this territory for months. The army keeps promising to step in, but they're stretched thin with Apache troubles further west. Will you go after them again? Yes, Miles said without hesitation. But first, I need to get you safely to town. They remounted and continued their journey. As the afternoon progressed, the terrain became more familiar to Miles. They were nearing Redemption Creek territory. We should reach town by nightfall, he told Pearl. Mrs. Winters runs a boarding house for respectable ladies. She'll have a room for you. Pearl was quiet for a moment. And what then, Marshal? I have no money, no family, no prospects. Miles hadn't thought that far ahead. We'll figure something out. Redemption Creek looks after its own. But I'm not one of your own, she said softly. I'm just a stranger you rescued. Something in her tone made Miles tighten his arm around her waist slightly. You're not a stranger anymore, Miss Montgomery. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of gold and red. It was nearly dusk when Miles spotted the telltale plume of dust in the distance behind them. Riders, he said tensely, hold on. He urged Thunder to a faster pace, heading for a stand of trees that would provide some cover. When they reached it, Miles dismounted quickly and helped Pearl down. Stay here with Thunder, he instructed, removing his rifle from its scabbard. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, or if you hear shooting that stops suddenly, take him and ride straight east. You'll reach the town in about an hour. Pearl's eyes widened. I'm not leaving you, Marshal. This isn't up for debate, Miss Montgomery. Miles checked his ammunition. I need to know you're safe. Before she could protest further, He moved through the trees to a position where he could observe the approaching riders. There were 3 of them, moving fast. Even at this distance, Miles recognized them as members of the Blackwater gang. He settled his rifle against his shoulder, taking careful aim at the lead rider. The distance was significant, but not impossible. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed through the trees. The lead rider jerked and fell from his horse. The other 2 immediately scattered, diving for cover. Miles fired again, hitting the ground near one of the outlaws. He needed to keep them pinned down long enough for Pearl to escape if necessary. A bullet splintered bark inches from his head. They had spotted his position. He rolled to a new location and fired again. One of the outlaws cried out, clutching his leg. The third was more cautious now, firing sporadically toward the trees. Miles was considering his next move when a shot rang out from behind him. The third outlaw fell forward, dropping his weapon. Miles turned to see Pearl standing a few yards away, holding his revolver in both hands, her expression a mixture of shock and determination. "He was flanking you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't just hide." Miles stared at her in astonishment. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My brother taught me. Father didn't approve." She lowered the gun slowly. Did I kill him?" Miles moved quickly to check the fallen outlaw. "Wounded in the shoulder. He'll live." He secured the man's weapons, then looked back at Pearl with new appreciation. "That was a hell of a shot, Miss Montgomery." She handed him back his revolver, her hand still shaking. "I've never shot a person before." "You saved my life." Miles holstered the weapon. "We need to move quickly. The wounded one won't go far, but the other might bring reinforcements." They returned to Thunder and resumed their journey, pushing harder now. Pearl remained silent, and Miles could feel the tension in her body. "It's not easy the first time you fire at another human," he said eventually. "But remember, you acted to save a life, not take one." "I know," she whispered. "I would do it again, if needed." The lights of Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon as full darkness descended. Miles felt Pearl relax slightly at the sight. "Almost there," he assured her. They rode down the main street, drawing curious stares from the townspeople still out at this hour. Miles stopped in front of the sheriff's office, where Deputy Jenkins burst out the door. "Marshal, thank God you're back. We were about to organize a search party." His eyes widened as he noticed Pearl. "You found her?" "This is Miss Pearl Montgomery," Miles said, helping her dismount. "She's had a rough few days and needs food, rest, and medical attention." Of course. Jenkins nodded vigorously. "Mrs. Winters has a room ready. We received the wire about the stagecoach victims." "Take her there, please," Miles instructed, "and send for Dr. Harris to check her injuries." Pearl looked at him with concern. "Where are you going?" "I need to organize a proper posse. 3 of the Blackwater gang are still out there, and now they're wounded and angry." Miles tried to smile reassuringly. "Get some rest, Miss Montgomery. You're safe now." Jenkins gently led Pearl toward the boarding house. She glanced back once, her eyes meeting Miles's with an expression he couldn't quite read. Inside the sheriff's office, Miles quickly wrote up his report and began planning the posse. The Blackwater gang had terrorized the region for too long. With 3 of their members down and a witness who could identify them, they finally had a chance to bring them to justice. But as he worked, his mind kept returning to Pearl, her courage, her skill with a firearm, the way she'd maintained her dignity despite her ordeal. Most of all, he remembered the moment he'd first seen her face, and that word that had escaped his lips without thought. Angel. 3 days passed before the posse returned to Redemption Creek. They'd tracked down the remaining members of the Blackwater gang to an abandoned mine, resulting in a fierce gunfight that left 2 outlaws dead and the leader, Silas Blackwater himself, in custody with a bullet in his leg. Miles had taken a bullet that grazed his side, but Dr. Harris assured him it would heal cleanly. Still, he'd lost blood and been ordered to rest for at least a week. "You're the most stubborn patient I've ever had," Dr. Harris complained, as he changed Miles's bandage in the small room above the sheriff's office. "That wound will open again if you don't stay still." "I have responsibilities," Miles protested, though he winced as the doctor applied a stinging antiseptic. "Your deputy is handling things just fine." Dr. Harris tied off the fresh bandage. Besides, I believe you have a visitor who would prefer you alive rather than heroically deceased from stupidity." Before Miles could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Dr. Harris opened it to reveal Pearl Montgomery, holding a covered basket. "Miss Montgomery," the doctor greeted her, "perhaps you can convince our marshal to follow medical advice. I've had no success." Pearl smiled. "I'll do my best, doctor." When they were alone, Pearl set the basket on the small table beside Miles's bed. "Mrs. Winters sent soup. She says you're too thin." Miles chuckled, then regretted it as pain shot through his side. "Mrs. Winters thinks everyone is too thin." Pearl removed the cloth covering the basket, revealing a container of soup and fresh bread. The aroma filled the small room, making Miles realize how hungry he was. "How are you feeling?" she asked, helping him sit up against the pillows. "I've had worse," he said, though truthfully, the wound pained him considerably. "How have you been settling in?" Pearl poured soup into a bowl. "Everyone has been very kind. Mrs. Winters is letting me stay until I find proper employment." She handed him the bowl and a spoon. "Mr. Peterson at the general store has offered me a position as a clerk." Miles took a spoonful of soup. "That's good work. Peterson is a fair employer." "Yes, though Mrs. Winters thinks I could do better." Pearl's lips curved in a slight smile. "She has rather ambitious plans for me, it seems." "Oh?" "She thinks I should open a school. Apparently, Redemption Creek has been without a teacher since Miss Holloway married a cattle baron last spring." Miles considered this. "We do need a teacher. Do you have experience?" "I was a governess for a time in Boston." Pearl sat in the chair beside his bed. "I enjoyed teaching." "Then perhaps Mrs. Winters isn't being ambitious enough," Miles said. "You certainly have the education and bearing for it." Pearl blushed slightly at the compliment. "It would require resources I don't have, a building, supplies. The town council has funds set aside for education. They've been trying to recruit a teacher from back east for months." Miles took another spoonful of soup. "You should speak with Mayor Collins." Pearl studied him for a moment. "You've done so much for me already, Marshal. I don't know how to thank you." "You saved my life in those woods," Miles reminded her. "I'd say we're even." A comfortable silence fell between them as Miles ate. Pearl gazed out the window at the busy street below. She'd acquired a new dress. Miles noticed a simple blue cotton that complemented her eyes. "They're hanging Blackwater tomorrow," he said eventually. "The judge arrived yesterday and held a special session this morning." Pearl turned back to him, her expression somber. "Will it bring closure, do you think? For his victims? For some. Others, it just ends a chapter." Miles set aside his empty bowl. "Justice is a poor substitute for what's been lost, but it's all we can offer sometimes." "I've been thinking about my father and brother," Pearl said softly. "They wanted adventure and opportunity in the West. I think they would want me to find those things too, not just grieve forever." "What do you want, Pearl?" Miles asked, using her first name without thinking. She didn't seem to mind the familiarity. "To build something meaningful, to not be afraid." She met his gaze directly. "To honor their memory by living well." Miles felt that strange tightening in his chest again. That sounds like a fine ambition. Another knock interrupted them. Deputy Jenkins opened the door slightly. "Sorry to disturb you, Marshal, but there's a situation at the saloon that needs attention." Miles started to rise, but Pearl placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Dr. Harris said you need rest." Jenkins nodded in agreement. "I can handle it, Marshal. Just wanted to keep you informed." "Go," Miles said with resignation, "but come back if it gets out of hand." After Jenkins left, Pearl gave Miles a reproving look. "You're a terrible patient." "So I've been told." He smiled despite himself. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The question came out more eagerly than he'd intended, and Miles felt uncharacteristically self-conscious. But Pearl's expression softened. "Yes, I'd like that." She gathered the empty soup container. "Rest now, Marshal. Redemption Creek needs you strong." After she left, Miles found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about Pearl Montgomery and the strange twist of fate that had brought her into his life. Something was happening to him, something he hadn't experienced before, and while part of him wanted to resist it, His life as marshal was dangerous and unpredictable. Another part of him was already surrendering to the inevitable. 2 weeks passed. Miles's wound healed well enough for him to return to limited duty. Pearl had spoken with Mayor Collins and secured the position of schoolteacher, with classes to begin once the old church building was renovated for educational purposes. Miles found himself seeking reasons to see her checking on the school renovations, escorting her to town meetings, stopping by Mrs. Winters' boarding house on his evening rounds. Each time, their conversations grew longer and more personal. He learned about her childhood in Boston, her love of literature, her dreams of traveling to Europe someday. He found himself sharing stories of his own, his years with the Rangers, his hopes for Redemption Creek's future, even memories of his parents that he rarely discussed with anyone. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Redemption Creek, nothing remained private for long. Mrs. Winters beamed approvingly whenever Miles called at the boarding house. Deputy Jenkins teased him about checking the school building 3 times in 1 week. Even Dr. Harris remarked that his most stubborn patient had become remarkably compliant with medical advice since a certain schoolteacher had taken an interest in his welfare. Miles ignored the gossip. What was happening between him and Pearl felt too precious, too fragile for public scrutiny. One evening in late October, Miles escorted Pearl from a town meeting where she'd presented her plans for the school curriculum. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Pearl walked close beside him, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. "The council seemed impressed with your proposals," Miles commented as they strolled down the boardwalk. "Mayor Collins suggested we might be able to afford more books by spring," Pearl replied, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Can you imagine? A proper library for the children." "I can imagine it," Miles said, watching her animated expression. "You've brought something special to this town, Pearl." She glanced up at him, her steps slowing. "What do you mean?" "Hope. Possibilities." Miles struggled to articulate what he meant. "Redemption Creek has always been about survival. You're making people think about thriving." Pearl smiled, a touch of color in her cheeks. "That's a lovely thing to say." They reached the boarding house steps, but neither made a move to part. Above them, stars filled the clear sky, brilliant against the darkness. "Would you—" Miles hesitated, uncharacteristically nervous. "Would you join me for dinner tomorrow? Not at the hotel restaurant or Mrs. Winters' table. My house. I could cook." Pearl's eyebrows rose slightly. "You cook, Marshal?" "Nothing fancy," he admitted. "But I can manage a decent stew without burning down the house." She laughed, the sound warming him more than his coat. "I would be delighted. What time should I arrive?" 6, and please, when we're not dealing with official business, I'd prefer if you called me Miles." "Miles," she repeated, as if testing the name. "Then I'll see you tomorrow at 6. "Miles." The way she said his name sent a pleasant shiver through him. "Good night, Pearl." "Good night." He waited until she was safely inside, before continuing down the street toward his small house at the edge of town. His mind was already racing ahead to, tomorrow he would need to clean the place thoroughly, find proper dishes, maybe ask Mrs. Peterson at the general store for advice on what to serve with the stew. Miles laughed at himself. 5 weeks ago, his concerns had been tracking outlaws and maintaining law and order. Now, he was worrying about tablecloths and dinner plates, because a beautiful, intelligent woman had agreed to dine at his home. Life took strange turns sometimes. The next evening, Miles paced his small living room nervously. He'd spent the day preparing cleaning his house until it shone, borrowing proper dinnerware from Mrs. Peterson, who had been delighted to help once she understood the occasion, and carefully preparing a venison stew with vegetables from Mr. Cooper's garden. He'd even purchased a bottle of decent wine from the hotel restaurant at an exorbitant price. A knock at the door sent his heart racing like a schoolboy's. Miles took a deep breath, smoothed down his freshly pressed shirt, and opened the door. Pearl stood on his porch, wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep green that complemented her golden hair, which she had styled in an elegant twist. She carried a small basket covered with a cloth. "Good evening," she said with a smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought dessert. Mrs. Winters insisted I shouldn't arrive empty-handed." Miles returned her smile, suddenly at ease. "Please, come in." He took the basket and her shawl, ushering her into the modest house. Pearl looked around with interest at the simple but comfortable furnishings. "What a lovely home," she commented, noticing the bookshelves filled with volumes. "You're quite the reader." "My mother loved books," Miles explained. "She taught both my sister and me to read before we were 5. The habit stuck." He gestured toward the small dining table he'd set by the window. "Would you like some wine before dinner?" Pearl nodded. "Yes, thank you." They settled into easy conversation as Miles served the wine and then the stew. Pearl complimented his cooking sincerely, seeming to enjoy the simple meal. For dessert, she had brought apple pie that she had baked herself under Mrs. Winters's supervision. "This is delicious," Miles said, after taking a bite. "You're full of surprises, Miss Montgomery." "As are you, Marshal Richardson," she returned with a teasing glint in her eye. "I never expected the town's stern lawman to be such an accomplished host." Miles laughed. "Stern? Am I? When I first saw you after you removed that awful sack, you looked quite forbidding," Pearl admitted. "Until you spoke." "What did I say?" Miles asked, curious because he could barely remember anything, except his stunned reaction to her beauty. Pearl's cheeks colored slightly. "Angel," you whispered. "No one had ever called me that before." Miles felt his own face warming. "I didn't realize I'd spoken aloud. It was just, you weren't what I expected to find in an outlaw camp." "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But when I saw you, it was like finding something precious in the most unlikely place." Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. Pearl set down her fork slowly. "I've never properly thanked you for saving my life," she said softly. "Words seem inadequate." "You don't owe me thanks," Miles replied. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Pearl shook her head. "Most wouldn't have ridden alone into outlaw territory on the slim chance of finding a stranger alive. You risked everything for me." Miles found himself moving to the chair beside hers, drawn by something he couldn't resist. "Pearl, A frantic knocking at the door interrupted him. Miles stood reluctantly, frustration clear on his face. "Marshal Richardson," a young voice called. Miles opened the door to find Tommy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, wide-eyed and breathless. "What is it, Tommy?" "Fire, sir, at the livery stable. Pa sent me to fetch you. It's spreading fast." Miles grabbed his coat. "I'll be right there." He turned to Pearl apologetically. "I'm sorry." "Go," she said immediately, already gathering her shawl. "I'll help evacuate people if needed." They rushed toward the center of town, where flames were already visible, leaping from the livery stable toward the adjacent buildings. The town's volunteer fire brigade was attempting to organize a bucket line, but the blaze was gaining momentum quickly. "Get those horses out!" Miles shouted, running toward the stable where panicked whinnies could be heard. Inside, 2 stable hands were struggling to lead frightened animals to safety. Miles joined them, covering his mouth against the thickening smoke. The heat was intense, flames already consuming the hayloft above. He managed to free 3 horses from their stalls, slapping their flanks to drive them toward the exit. "Anyone else inside?" he called to a soot-covered stable hand. "Don't think so," the man coughed. "But the fire's going to take the general store next if we don't stop it." Miles emerged from the stable, eyes stinging. The town's residents had formed a more organized bucket line now, passing water from the well to the burning building. Pearl was among them, her green dress now smudged with soot as she worked alongside the townspeople. For hours they fought the fire. The livery stable was lost completely, but they managed to save the general store and prevent the flames from spreading further. By dawn, the danger had passed, leaving exhausted townspeople surveying the damage in the gray morning light. Miles found Pearl sitting on a bench outside the general store, her face streaked with soot, her elegant hairstyle long since collapsed into a disheveled braid. "Are you all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. She nodded wearily. "Yes, just tired." She looked at him with concern. "You were very brave, running into the burning stable like that." "Just doing my job." Miles noticed a small burn on her hand. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," Pearl dismissed it. "A spark caught me while passing buckets." Miles gently took her hand, examining the angry red mark. "You should have Dr. Harris look at this." "Later," she said, not withdrawing her hand from his. "Miles, about dinner." "I'll make it up to you," he promised. "Perhaps next Sunday?" Pearl smiled despite her exhaustion. "I'd like that." She hesitated, then added softly, "I enjoyed what little time we had." Miles found himself holding her gaze, acutely aware that they were in the middle of the street with numerous townspeople nearby. But in that moment, he didn't care. "So did I," he said, still holding her hand. "Very much." Something in his tone made Pearl's eyes widen slightly. A delicate blush appeared beneath the soot on her cheeks. Mayor Collins approached them, interrupting the moment. "Marshal, Miss Montgomery, the town owes you both a debt of gratitude. Your quick actions helped save half the business district." The spell broken, Miles reluctantly released Pearl's hand and stood to speak with the mayor about damage assessment and investigation into the fire's cause. Pearl excused herself to help Mrs. Winters distribute coffee to the exhausted firefighters. As she walked away, Miles found himself watching her. Struck by the realization that his feelings for Pearl Montgomery had grown far deeper than he'd been ready to admit, even to himself. The fire investigation revealed that a kerosene lamp had been knocked over by a startled horse. No foul play was suspected, though the loss of the livery stable was a significant blow to the town. The owner, Mr. Hargrove, had been uninsured and now faced financial ruin. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek rallied. A town meeting was called, and funds were collected to help rebuild. Pearl suggested organizing a benefit dinner and auction, an idea that was enthusiastically received. She threw herself into the planning, working closely with the town's women to prepare food and gather items for auction. Miles found his admiration for her growing as he watched her coordinate these efforts. She had a natural way with people, gently but firmly directing the more fractious personalities toward a common goal. Even Mrs. Billingsley and Mrs. Thompson, notorious rivals who hadn't spoken directly to each other in 3 years, were working side by side under Pearl's supervision. The Sunday dinner Miles had promised was postponed due to these preparations, but he saw Pearl daily as she moved around town, organizing the benefit. Each encounter left him more certain of his feelings, though he struggled to find the right moment to express them. The benefit was scheduled for Saturday evening in the town hall. By mid-afternoon, the building had been transformed with autumn decorations, tables laden with food, and a display of auction items ranging from hand-sewn quilts to carpentry services. Miles arrived early to help with security arrangements, knowing that events with money-changing hands sometimes attracted troublemakers. He spotted Pearl directing the final preparations, looking radiant in a blue dress that matched her eyes. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that framed her face beautifully, with a few strands escaping to curl softly around her temples. She noticed him and crossed the room with a smile. "Marshal, what do you think?" "Impressive," he said, looking around at the decorated hall. "You've accomplished a lot in a short time." "Everyone helped," Pearl replied modestly. "This town has such community spirit." "Because you inspired them," Miles said. "You've brought people together who normally avoid each other." Pearl laughed. "I merely suggested a common goal. People want to help their neighbors, given the chance." Before Miles could respond, Mayor Collins called Pearl away to resolve a dispute about the auction order. Miles watched her mediate the disagreement with diplomatic skill, marveling at how quickly she had become an integral part of Redemption Creek's community. The benefit began at 6 o'clock. Nearly everyone in town attended, dressed in their Sunday best and eager to support Mr. Hargrove. Pearl had arranged for the town's amateur musicians to provide entertainment, and the atmosphere was festive despite the circumstances that had prompted the gathering. The auction was particularly successful, with townspeople bidding generously on the offered items. Miles himself won a hand-knitted scarf that he had noticed Pearl admiring, paying far more than it was worth, but considering it money well spent. As the evening progressed, Miles found himself constantly aware of Pearl's presence in the room. She moved gracefully among the townspeople, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the crowded hall, and Miles felt a connection that transcended the noise and activity around them. After the auction concluded, the musicians began playing for dancing. Miles watched as several of the town's eligible bachelors approached Pearl for a dance. She accepted politely, moving with natural grace around the floor. Something akin to jealousy stirred in Miles as he observed young Dr. Wilson laughing with her during a particularly lively tune. "You're staring, Marshal," Mrs. Winters said, appearing beside him with a knowing smile. "A woman notices such things." Miles cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Just making sure everything remains orderly, Mrs. Winters." "Indeed." The older woman's eyes twinkled with amusement. "You know, Miss Montgomery has received 2 marriage proposals already since arriving in town." Miles's head snapped toward her. "What?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Peterson's nephew from Denver and that cattle buyer who was here last week." Mrs. Winters looked smug at his reaction. "She declined them both, of course." "Did she say why?" Miles asked before he could stop himself. Mrs. Winters patted his arm. "Perhaps her heart is already engaged elsewhere." With that cryptic statement, she moved away to supervise the refreshment table. The music changed to a slower waltz. Miles watched Pearl thank Dr. Wilson for the dance and moved to the edge of the floor. Before another partner could claim her, he found himself crossing the room toward her. "May I have this dance, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, extending his hand. Pearl looked up at him with surprise that quickly transformed into pleasure. "I'd be honored, Marshal." As Miles led her onto the dance floor, he was acutely aware of the eyes following them. It was rare for him to participate in such social activities. As Marshal, he usually maintained a certain distance from the merrymaking. "I believe we're causing a sensation," Pearl murmured as they began to waltz. "Let them talk," Miles replied, surprising himself with his lack of concern. "You dance beautifully." "My mother insisted on proper training," Pearl said, "though I never particularly enjoyed the stuffy Boston ballrooms where I was expected to display these skills. And now, are you enjoying yourself?" Miles guided her through a turn, his hand firm but gentle at her waist. "Very much," she answered, her eyes meeting his directly. "The company makes all the difference." The music seemed to fade around them as they moved together, their steps perfectly matched as if they had danced together for years rather than minutes. Miles found himself lost in her gaze, in the feeling of her hand in his, in the subtle scent of lavender that surrounded her. "Pearl," he said softly, "I've been meaning to tell you." Once again, they were interrupted, this time by a commotion near the entrance. Deputy Jenkins was arguing with someone just outside the door. Miles reluctantly released Pearl. "Excuse me," he said. "I should see what's happening." Pearl nodded in understanding, though disappointment flashed briefly in her eyes. At the door, Miles found Jenkins blocking the entrance to prevent a disheveled, clearly intoxicated man from entering. The man was unfamiliar to Miles, probably a drifter passing through. "What seems to be the problem?" Miles asked. "This fellow wants to join the party," Jenkins explained. "Told him he's in no condition, but he's being insistent." The man squinted at Miles's badge. "You the law? I got as much right as anybody to be here." "This is a private benefit for a town resident," Miles explained firmly. "You're welcome to visit the saloon instead." "Been there already," the man slurred. "Heard there was better liquor here." He attempted to push past them. Miles blocked his path. "Sir, I'm asking you politely to move along." The man's face darkened. "You think you're better'n me? This whole stuck-up town thinks it's so special." His hand moved toward his hip where a pistol was holstered. Miles reacted instantly, grabbing the man's wrist before he could draw. "That would be a mistake," Miles said quietly. The music inside had stopped, and he was aware of the crowd watching. "Jenkins, escort our friend here to the jail to sober up." The deputy took hold of the man's arm. "Come on, mister. You can sleep it off and be on your way in the morning." The man resisted briefly, then seemed to realize he was outnumbered as several town men moved forward to assist if needed. He allowed Jenkins to lead him away, muttering obscenities. Miles turned to the concerned onlookers. "Everything's fine, folks. Please continue enjoying yourselves." As the music resumed, Pearl approached him. "Is everything all right?" "Just a drunk drifter," Miles assured her. "Jenkins is handling it." Pearl studied his face. "You're always on duty, aren't you? Even at a social gathering." "It's the nature of the job," Miles admitted. "Not very conducive to a normal life." "What would a normal life look like to you, Miles?" Pearl asked softly. The question caught him off guard. He had never allowed himself to consider the possibility of a life beyond his badge, a home filled with family rather than solitude. someone to share his days and nights. But looking at Pearl now, he could suddenly envision it with painful clarity. "I'm not sure I know anymore," he answered honestly, "but I'm beginning to wonder." Their eyes held for a long moment. Around them, the benefit continued. People dancing, laughing, enjoying the respite from daily concerns. But between Miles and Pearl, something profound and unspoken hung in the air. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" Miles asked. Pearl nodded. "Yes, I would." He led her through a side door onto the small porch that overlooked the town square. The night was clear and cool, stars brilliant above them. The muffled sounds of music and conversation from inside created a sense of privacy despite their public location. "The benefit is a success," Pearl said, leaning against the porch railing. "Mr. Hargrove should have enough to start rebuilding." "Thanks to you." Miles moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You've accomplished something remarkable." Pearl turned to face him. "We never finished our conversation. Twice now. We've been interrupted when you seemed about to say something important." Miles took a deep breath. "Perhaps that's the universe suggesting I should be more direct." He turned to face her fully. "Pearl, in the short time you've been in Redemption Creek, you've become incredibly important to me, more than I thought possible." Her eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know your circumstances for coming here were tragic," Miles went on, "and perhaps your future plans don't include staying in a small frontier town, but I need you to know that He hesitated, then pressed on. "That my feelings for you have grown into something far deeper than friendship or admiration." Pearl's expression softened. "Miles, please, let me finish before something else interrupts us," he said with a small smile. "I'm not a wealthy man. I have a dangerous job and a simple home. But everything I have, everything I am, I would share with you, if you'd consider a future here. With me." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Pearl's eyes glistened in the starlight. "When I first arrived in Redemption Creek," she said finally, "I was lost in every sense. I had no family, no direction, no hope." She moved a step closer to him. "You gave me back my life that day in the mountains. But in the weeks since, you've given me something more precious, a reason to build a new life here." Miles felt his heart pounding as she continued. "My feelings for you caught me by surprise," Pearl admitted. "I wasn't looking for this. But every day, with each conversation, each moment spent in your company, I've found myself falling deeper." She looked up at him with absolute clarity in her eyes. "I love you, Miles Richardson. And yes, I would very much like to consider a future here with you." Miles reached for her hands, holding them gently in his. "Pearl Montgomery, you've bewitched me from the moment I pulled that sack from your head and whispered angel." "Then perhaps you should kiss me," Pearl suggested softly, "before we're interrupted again." Miles needed no further invitation. He drew her closer, one hand moving to cradle her face as their lips met in a kiss that held all the tenderness and promise of new love. Pearl's arm slipped around his neck as she responded with equal fervor, her body fitting perfectly against his. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Miles rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Pearl. I think I have since that first moment." She smiled up at him, radiant with happiness. "Then, we've wasted quite enough time already, wouldn't you say, Marshal?" Miles laughed softly. "Indeed we have, Miss Montgomery. Indeed we have." The spring sun cast golden light across the newly planted garden behind the Richardson home. Pearl knelt among the rows of vegetables, carefully placing bean seeds in the freshly turned soil. From inside the house, she could hear Miles's voice as he read a story to little Sarah, their 3-year-old daughter, whose laughter bubbled through the open window. 5 years had passed since that night on the town hall porch, when they'd finally confessed their feelings. They had married just 2 months later, in a ceremony attended by the entire town. Pearl had continued teaching at the school, now housed in a proper building rather than the renovated church, until Sarah's birth. Life as a marshal's wife wasn't always easy. Miles still faced danger regularly, and Pearl had spent more than a few nights pacing their bedroom floor, waiting for his safe return. But they had built a beautiful life together, a home filled with books and music and love. Redemption Creek had grown considerably. The railroad had finally extended a line to the town, bringing new businesses and residents. Miles had hired 2 additional deputies to help manage the increased responsibilities. Pearl's school now employed 3 teachers, though she still served on the education committee and occasionally substituted when needed. "Need any help out here?" Miles asked, stepping into the garden with Sarah perched on his shoulders. The little girl had her mother's golden hair and her father's determined expression. "I'm nearly finished," Pearl replied, smiling up at them. "Is story time over already?" "She insisted on coming to find you," Miles explained, lifting Sarah down to the ground. The child immediately ran to Pearl, throwing her small arms around her mother's neck. "Mama, Papa said we can have pie for supper," Sarah announced excitedly. Pearl raised an eyebrow at her husband. "Did he now?" Miles shrugged innocently. "Mrs. Winters brought it over while you were at the committee meeting. It would be impolite not to eat it." "Of course," Pearl agreed solemnly, though her eyes danced with amusement. "We must observe proper etiquette." Sarah, satisfied that pie was indeed in her future, wandered off to examine a butterfly fluttering among the flowers Pearl had planted along the garden fence. Miles offered his hand to help Pearl to her feet, then kept hold of it, pulling her gently against him. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Mrs. Richardson?" "You mentioned it this morning," Pearl replied, slipping her arms around his waist. "But I wouldn't object to hearing it again." "I love you," he said, bending to kiss her softly. "More today than yesterday, though not as much as tomorrow." Pearl returned his kiss, her heart still fluttering at his touch even after 5 years of marriage. "Such poetry from our stern Marshal. Only for you," Miles murmured against her hair. "Always for you, my angel." From across the garden, Sarah called out excitedly about her butterfly discovery. Miles and Pearl turned toward their daughter, hands still entwined, faces illuminated with the quiet joy of a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, with a burlap sack, a rescue, and a whispered word of wonder.